Morning, everybody. So I'm Gavin McLaughlin from XIO. I have the lovely job of introducing XIO, giving you a quick recap of really where we fit in the marketplace, where we don't fit in the marketplace, and kind of where we've been doing business and who's buying our stuff, for want of a better term. I'm going to hand over some future sessions that are going to go quite deep dive. So don't worry, there's only about 6 slides that go through the more marketing and positioning orientated stuff before we hand into the deep dive technical stuff. We've also brought equipment with us, so we're going to be handing stuff around the table, so it will be quite hands-on. And we'll get into any questions you've got about where we're a fit. So the biggest question I get asked is, who is XIO? What do we actually do out there? So we've been around for a number of years, as Stephen said in the introduction, and what we've been delivering is essentially storage hardware. So there's a lot of people confusing and blurring some of the lines between software and hardware in storage. We won't get into the software-defined storage thing too much because you're probably going to hear a lot of that this week. And people claiming different things, thank you. We are a hardware company. What we do is provide higher levels stack integration, and we'll be talking, particularly David will be talking later today about some of that stuff in other sessions. But what we've been doing is fixing some of what we believe are the fundamental problems in storage hardware that have been out there for years. And the good news is, rather than a lot of things that are coming out at the moment with marketing claims about fixing storage hardware problems, we've actually got proof points. So about 5-6 years ago, we started selling a system that threw a lot of people off course and said we could provide hardware that doesn't need to be touched for 5 years. At which point everyone says, yeah, it's a marketing claim, show us some proof. And we couldn't prove it. We could show statistics, but we couldn't actually prove it. Now we can. If you go to our website, there's plenty of customers who've had boxes for 5 years and have never seen an engineer, not needed to see an engineer. Our kit just sits in the background and just works. So we've now got the proof points of those. But what we're trying to do is, rather than selling technology for technology's sake, is actually explain where it's a good fit and what problems it solves. Rather than what you may have seen, being quite open from XIO in the past, is us claiming we are storage amazing people, we can solve problems, but they don't necessarily affect customers. So what we're trying to do is translate that into the effect it has. So we'll talk about that a great deal. What we're really doing right now in our direction is actually providing storage for what we actually call the post-SAN era. There's been a lot of conversations, particularly actually I've noticed in the last couple of weeks, about where the storage marketplace is going, whether that should be done in the server, and we've been talking about stuff like vSANs, whether that should be done through modular unified storage, whether we should stick with the old enterprise framed ways of doing things, or whether we see storage complementing what is increasingly becoming feature-rich hypervisors. So where we're seeing that functionality moving up into VMware, Hyper-V, or whatever applications are being used, and actually the storage hardware being good at its job, and quite frankly becoming a silent element that sits there and just works and doesn't actually cause grief. And we'll talk about some examples of that in a minute. But actually looking at what are the core attributes that are needed from storage, rather than some of the whistles and bells. I've worked in storage long enough, sadly, to see this rise of the software features that get more and more embedded into the controller, until quite often someone turns around and says, well, do I actually need those features, A? B, have I already got them somewhere else in my stack? And C, exactly how much are you charging me for not only the software, but the software maintenance of that thereafter? So one of the things we talk about is what attributes we've got in our product that affect things in the higher stack, rather than going into features which may not apply to the situation. And that also gives us something which is very important to us, which is predictability. One of the things hopefully you're going to hear from us over the next couple of sessions is about predictable reliability, predictable performance, not necessarily the fastest or the highest levels of availability, but how we can make things extremely predictable. And I think that's something that's been missing from the storage industry as a whole for quite some time. There's been a lot of compromises. And then lastly, one of the things that's become our passion, especially of late, is automation through open APIs. Rather than saying this is how you manage our box, providing the APIs to let people write their own integration, writing our own integration into things like VMware management tools, into Microsoft management tools, into other third-party tools, but giving that open integration so that people can actually just manage storage like they manage servers. there still seems to be quite a disconnect between the simplicity that vAdmins are seeing and the requirements that are needed in storage. So we're going to show some screenshots of some stuff. We're going to talk about that integration and also hopefully get some of your feedback as to what we should be developing. So we don't want this to be a one-way thing. We need some feedback as well as to what we should be doing. But I think if I was to sum up how I feel about where storage is at the moment, I'm seeing a lot of confusion as to what storage should provide. And it's an analogy that actually come around because I had some building work done at home recently. And the builder, when I moaned at him about how slow he was going, when he was below the ground, said, look, you don't realise when you're building a house, you spend at least a third of your time underground. Because if you don't get the foundations right, you're in big trouble. Everything you build above those foundations is going to go wrong if you haven't got solid, predictably reliable foundations in your house. And it dawned on me that's kind of what we're doing with the storage hardware. I keep seeing lots of discussions about how the rise of the software-defined data center means that we can go out and buy cheap commodity hardware. That scares me big time, both because obviously it affects us in XIO because we don't believe in that argument, but actually for the whole storage industry, because you can get into a situation where people perceive storage as being a pain in the backside and try to find alternative ways to do things. The truth is we spent a lot of time fixing the foundations to enable other people to actually provide the components to build the house. Now we provide integration all the way through the house, but it is really the foundations that we really, really affect. So what I'm just going to do is just do a couple of slides that talk about where we think our products fit today. And I know this has been a point in some of the pre-sessions material that's come up, what the products are, because we actually have one product that just puts itself in different guises. This here, the intelligent storage element, is the product. It just morphs itself in slightly different ways. How we think the market is changing, and please give us feedback on that as to whether we've got it right. And how what we believe our intelligent storage element is in a prime position to take advantage of this change and to help people get through this change. But the one thing I use, probably too much, to describe our products is we provide a balance of cost, growth and risk. I've been using this graphic for a very, very long time. By growth, I mean in terms of both performance and capacity. But all too often, we've seen people providing imbalanced storage. Hands up, I worked at EMC back in the day, and at EMC, the whole mantra in the late 90s was people were prepared to pay very high cost for low risk storage. What I'm starting to see is actually the complete inverse of that, worryingly in the market, that people are saying, oh, don't worry, we'll go and get low cost storage because we can now because the features are up in the hypervisor stack, and all they're doing is increasing their risk.
But you could say that to a certain degree, the technology in those days wasn't anywhere near as reliable as it is today, and we couldn't use commodity to the same way we could today.
Fair point.
So when you were paying for that hardware, you were paying for something that was engineered deliberately.
Yeah.
So that, you know, it's a changed model since then.
But what was interesting was, I found at that time, it was almost a knee-jerk reaction, is that if you look at the difference between the cost of JBODs in the late 90s and say an EMC Symmetrics, it was huge, the cost difference, which meant there was this huge imbalance. So we went from one imbalanced 3 balls to another imbalanced 3 balls.
What I would say though at the moment is, if you look at something like a VMAX,
yeah,
they are stuffing them full of JBODs and then still charging an absolute fortune for that privilege, which isn't really fair to be
Well, it's fair to the stockholders.
Oh, it is to them, yeah, but not if you're the guy paying for the equipment.
It's a free world. You don't have to buy it from them.
Well, there you go.
Yeah, but there's some people that will buy it because of the badge. But there you go. That's a whole another conversation which we could spend a lot of time on. So where do we fit? This slide is going to really dumb down the market, and a few of you may sigh, so I apologise for it. And it is deliberately dumbing down things. Looking at storage under the old way of price per gig, or under what's increasingly seen the price per IOP thing. So we all know, you know, that the serial ATA cheap and deep guys are going to always talk about price per gig. The all-flash players are going to talk about the price per IOP and use every distraction technique known to man to avoid the price per gig conversation. And there's different types of storage that really fit in different use cases. One of the things that we've been very open and honest about is where we believe different use cases fit with different technologies and where we fit within that grid. So one of the things that we used to have a habit of doing a lot in XIO was talking about we solve every problem. We don't solve every problem. In fact, you could probably argue we need to narrow this a little bit more. So we don't go and play in the extremes. We don't play in cheap and deep. We don't play in the all-flash array market, and we'll do a job of explaining why we don't play heavily in that market. But we have technology that we believe affects a lot of use cases, and we focus in on some of these, particularly around VDI or hosted desktop. We spend a lot of time making sure that we provide the integrated solution stack, rather than saying things like, we're good storage for VDI, what can we do to make that a painless experience, both for the end users and for the channel partners who are building solutions out of this stuff. What we are finding...
You know, Gavin, I find that IOPS per dollar is kind of an interesting problem, because I mean, with the all-flash arrays, they're very, very expensive, but they also deliver very, very high IOPS. So
yep.
I would say it's not correct where you have all-flash arrays there. Because when I look at like SPC1 and stuff like that, typically the guys that have done best in IOPS per dollar are the flash arrays. Very small amount of flash, but a high number of IOPS.
Yeah, and the whole point here is that there is a requirement for it. So whether it's here or here, where we're putting it, it's an arguable point. What I tend to look at is when we go into battle, for want of a better term, with an all-flash array company, invariably one of us is in the wrong space. Quite commonly, it's them. So a good example is VDI. The amount of all-flash arrays that can do 1 million IOPS I've seen sold. I actually come across one that was a 500-seat VDI implementation where they built an SLC flash array. They could have gone and bought every user the highest-end MacBook Pros and sent them on luxury holidays for the money they paid for that flash array, rather than putting VDI in. The business case was kind of nuts on that.
Well, the VDI business case is often quite nutters.
Yeah. So that was one example, but at the same time, I have, hands up, we've come across, there was one I had a while ago that was a use case in Europe where we actually turned around to the customer and said, go and buy an all-flash array. Okay? We're not a fit, the latency requirement and the specific data loading meant that we weren't a great fit. We could just about meet it, but for his specifications. But that's where we put our hands up, and we will qualify out very, very openly. And it's interesting that honesty has got us, that customer, other storage from us for other use cases. Don't you love it when PowerPoint does that? So the whole point here is to try and explain where we fit in that middle space. But this does move around, and don't take these as set, because there will be requirements. Sometimes people want to deploy Exchange is a good example, but don't want to take the reliability headache of serial ATA, so they actually want to come into the SAS hard disk array space to get the reliability up, and we'll talk about an example of that in a minute. So what we do is we use the same modular storage in the intelligent storage element, just with different drive configurations, whether it be a hybrid, and we'll explain how our hybrid is different in a minute, or a hard disk model, and then depending on the configuration within that box, for example, RAID 1 or RAID 5 LUNs, we can provide different IOPS per terabyte. So a good example is something we did with Citrix recently, where we provide a Citrix ready architecture, which is a set configuration, I believe, of 750-seat desktops, where within that we looked, there are two performance ranges. There's the boot performance range, and then there's the actual day-to-day workload, which was simulated with login VSI. So we have two different performance requirements, but what we can do is use different configurations, even within a single box, in order to meet those differing requirements. So we can dial up and dial down. This has been particularly of interest into things like cloud service providers who are providing a range of different workloads, but want to do it from small modular units and pay as they go and deploy as they need it, rather than buying one big frame and then having to kind of take a gamble on it. And then, as I said, we can either use the hybrid or the hard disk one. A couple of people taking photos, so I'll let them run. So, who buys our stuff? Who uses it and who gets the most from it? And we thought we'd just pick a couple of examples. Cloud service providers has been a huge market for us, particularly in the mid-range cloud service providers. The reason being, our number one is simplicity. I keep thinking back to a customer in Europe that we have called RTW Hosting. There's also one in the US recently that said very similar quotes, which is called Broad Aspect, where they've just said that storage used to be a pain in the backside. Quite frankly, they just want storage to sit in the corner and work and be managed by VMware trained guys. They don't want storage specialists. They just want something sitting in the background. They moved from a very feature-rich NAS deployment to our storage completely, and as they said, it just sits in the background. They've now had it deployed for 2 years. They've never seen an engineer. They've never had a service call. This stuff just sits there and works and is extremely performant. So number one was simplicity, that it works for them. Predictable performance was a big thing with them. They kept getting customers complain about performance workloads. The reason for that is they were actually filling the storage up to about 70, 75% and starting to noticing a tail off. We're talking in a later session when we get into the technology how we don't have that problem and how we get away from that problem. So why, when you fill our box up to 99, it's going to run at the same performance level as when it was 0% full. And again, for cloud providers, that's become important because that 25% they can't fill up is margin. So there's a reason why we've been selling a lot into that space, and there's been some good examples. And then a lot of cross-industry organizations who really want simplicity and reliability. A good example is Kingfisher. Those of you in Europe may have heard of Kingfisher because they're branded as B&Q and Screwfix over there. Over here, you probably call the equivalent is Home Depot. So they're a do-it-yourself retail store. Their problem was just that storage was failing. They had 2 triple disk RAID 6 set failures and lost data twice. Storage was a pain in the backside. It was arguably a cheap and deep storage space, but they found they could buy our stuff with a 6-year lifespan without being touched, cheaper than they could buy some serial ATA stuff over a 3-year lifespan. So that was a good example of someone who just wants storage to go away because of an operational overhead. And they've actually since deployed some more storage from us to do VDI. So they bought us for the low-end workload. They've now gone out and bought more to do the high-end workload. And what we aim to do is fill the gap in between and sell them lots more.
With companies like that, where it's kind of an operational cost to them,
yeah,
of having things like RAID rebuilds, that's often not actually factored into when people go and buy some storage arrays.
Totally.
Because it's hard to count.
Yeah.
How do you deal with customers with that issue?
We have to work with the customer to get their own numbers out of them. In that one, we didn't. The TCO was built purely, actually, off the cost of acquisition and the maintenance costs.
Okay.
That was it purely. We didn't factor in the cost of RAID rebuilds, the cost of an operation thing, because that's when you start getting silly TCO numbers. And we've all used those where you start making up numbers.
Did a vendor
Depends
just
what you mean by cost.
call TCO soft costs silly?
Yeah. Drives me nuts. I've seen, it bugs me. The years I've worked in this industry, and then people go, and this solution will provide you with 40,000% return on investment. Oh, Jesus. Please don't do that.
I love the, this costs you 20 seconds per employee per day, and we'll calculate that out into the TCO, as if you gave those people that 20 seconds back, they would do something useful.
You know the whole reason, I won't say who I've worked for.
I'm sorry, 1 second of downtime, unless you're actually doing online commerce, has no cost.
I won't say who I've worked for previously. You can all go on LinkedIn and have a look who I've worked for previously. But yeah, the reason I've done that in past lives is everything's about TCO is because the CapEx cost is so high. So you use it to try and justify it and to hide things.
Well, and Gartner uses it to justify their very existence, but that's a whole other
So
story.
we use it to reinforce the point that our pricing is good. So our CapEx price is good, and then we use the TCO as and another thing.
Right.
We don't have to rely on it.
And then you could save more money because it doesn't blow up.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, which is, funny enough, that's the bit that matters. It's quite funny. The CFO cares about the TCO number, whereas the admins are sitting there going, no, we want it because it'll just take that pain away.
Well,
so
right.
just go back to that.
Spend time thinking about other things that are far more useful to me instead of running.
I could spend weekends with my family.
Family or deploying the new application, figuring out how to virtualize the next thing or whatever they are set out to do. So they can spend time where they matter.
I'm on camera, so I have to agree with family. That's all. And then the other one is a lot of performance-driven applications that require balance of cost, growth, and risk. There are loads of companies that have come to us and said, we've looked at some SLC flash arrays, and we just cannot justify the cost. The techies are turned on. They think that 1 million IOPS is fantastic, But the truth is we know we don't need 1 million amps. We need around 100,000. What can you do? And actually, when we've gone head-to-head against the flash array, invariably, we are the same performance with a hybrid, a fraction of the cost, and even things like power usage are lower, and we'll explain later about power usage and why we're lower than flash. And again, there's a good example in Argus in the US that just wanted to get rid of a bottleneck in their data warehousing environment, and the hybrid storage can actually solve that. What's interesting is our hard disk storage normally competes with other hybrid players. So we've solved a lot of performance problems in hard disks, means our overlap is different. So we play hard disks against hybrid, and then hybrid against all flash arrays, which we'll come on to and explain a little bit more. Hopefully that's given you a quick intro into where we fit from a positioning point of view and from a product point of view. What we're going to do in the next session is go a little bit deep dive into the actual technology, not just how we do it, but why it matters. Because we don't want to come across as we're just doing technology for coolness sake. We're doing it because we think it affects things. Thank you for your time.